safe place to learn the good and the bad with Alicia. I'm Alicia, and I just finished week 1 of Texas government for the summer to 2020 semester. For week 1, we really just did introductions. We went over chapter 1 through 3 and 10. My professor prefers to do the book a little differently than it's organized. She thinks her way makes just a little bit more sense. We also took a exam on what we covered this week. I'll post more details about the book that we're using down below. It's called Governing Texas, if you're interested in looking, following along, anything like that. Yeah, so in today's video, I'll be discussing Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled The Political Culture, People, and Economy of Texas. Chapter 1 objectives include being able to describe the defining characteristics of political culture in Texas, explain how Texas's geography has influenced its political culture, trace the evolution of Texas's economy, and explain how the population of Texas has changed over time. So our first section in this chapter is titled Why Texas's Political Culture Matters. In this section, we talk about how John Steinbeck, a Nobel and Pulitzer Prize-winning American novelist, once described Texas as a state of mind, a mystique closely approximating a religion. He believed that despite the many differences across the huge state, there was a cohesiveness among Texans like no other place in America. Writing that basically no matter who you are or where you are in Texas or where you're from in Texas, you're all about Texas. Being from Virginia, I can absolutely see this. Last semester, I was actually asked by Professor MC to ask Keith, a native Texan, what makes Texas exceptional. I had to prod him a little bit and asked him what he thought made Texas better than other states. His response was that Texas has no state taxes, barbecue, state pride. There's a 80-mile-per-hour speed limit, but mostly it's just home to him. He loves it because it's home, and I think we can all kind of appreciate that. I asked him if he knew where his state pride came from, and he kind of said that he doesn't really have any idea. It was like everyone in Texas was just born onto this huge team, and you're all kind of just rooting for anyone from Texas. Just yay Texas, you know? So Texas political culture. Political culture is the broadly shared values, beliefs, and attitudes about how the government should function and just how politics should really operate. The American political culture is traditionally viewed as emphasizing liberty, equality, democracy, which can really all mean something different depending on the time and place. Texas has a traditionalistic, individualistic political culture, believing that government should be dominated by the political elites, guided by tradition, combined with the belief that government should limit its role in providing order in society so that citizens can pursue their economic self-interest. The political elite are highly respected, and there's a big emphasis on the value of hard work and self-interest in the economic life of the state. And like Keith said, Texas really likes to keep its taxes low, so social services are minimal, and the Texas political elite, like business leaders, really have a big say in how the state is run. There have been 3 long-lasting patterns in Texas politics, and the changes that they undergo, including the one-party state, the idea of provincialism, and business dominance. So the one-party state persists. Texas has traditionally been a single-party state. For over 100 years, Texas was actually dominated by the Democratic Party. That was up until 1978 when Clements, a Republican, won governor. And then he was actually reelected again in 1986. And that began a competition between the two parties that lasted throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. After redistricting in 2002, the Republicans ended up winning a majority. In the Senate, they won by 7 votes, and in the House, they won by 24 votes. And this really lit a fire under them, and they continued to grow until they dominated in 2016. Now Texas is pretty much dominated by the Republican Party. They control most of the suburban, exurban, and rural areas, but it's grown increasingly conservative and divided. Moderate pro-business Republicans clash with cultural conservatives who campaign things like marriage, border security, and school choice. And then the Democratic Party that controls the urban areas of Texas has become a party that's filled with liberal whites and minorities that are seeking a progressive agenda that emphasize things like pro-choice, LGBTQ rights, and the public education. The party really sees the growing Latino population as a way back into political prominence. So things are definitely changing, and I guess we'll see how that goes in the future. Provincialism is a narrow, limited, and self-interested view of the world, often associated with rural values and notions of limited government, often resulting in intolerance of diversity and a lack of public interest, leading to the dismissal of social services and funding for things like public education. The racism and intolerance of other cultures, particularly that of the Confederate States, played a large role in defining provincialism in traditional political culture. Though Texas has traditionally been a white man's state, increased urbanization, increased minority, female, and LGBTQ influence in politics, as well as the increasing importance of Texas in the global economy, has begun to level the playing field. However, there have been several cases of intolerance towards minorities and a resurgence of some of the more negative values associated with provincialism in Texas, such as racism and homophobia. Business dominance. Business is boss in Texas. Labor unions are rare in Texas, aside from the oil fields around Beaumont, Port Arthur, and consumer interest groups are poorly organized and poorly funded. Big business groups play a huge role in politics here in Texas. They make contributions, organize interest groups, and assist lobbyists. However, this is being challenged by a strong social conservative wing of the Republican Party that's less concerned about business than things like bathroom regulation, border control, and traditional marriage. So, the land in Texas. Texas became a republic in 1836, claiming 216 million acres, roughly 350,000 square miles of unappropriated land, making them super land rich but really money poor, only having $55.68 in their state treasury at the time. The exact boundaries of Texas were really contentious throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The Republic claimed land as far west as what's now Las Cruces, New Mexico, and as far north as what's now Rawlins, Wyoming. When Texas joined the Union in 1845, it became the only state that wasn't one of the original 13 colonies to keep control of its public lands. And privatizing these public lands was one of the most important ongoing public policies the state pursued during the 19th century. Privatizing the public property would establish rules and regulations under which the economic development would take place within the state. The privatization also gave the state the mineral rights to these lands, providing funds for school levels for the next 160 years. After the Mexican-American War, a treaty was signed in 1848 establishing the Rio Grande as the southern border. In the Compromise of 1850 between the North and the South, the current western border of Texas was established as after Texas threatened with military force, to reassert the western land claims. In exchange for $10 million from the federal government in federal bonds, Texas gave up claims to 67 million acres of land, which are now New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. This gave Texas the chance to pay off its debt and retain the remaining 98 million acres that then was divided into 4 distinct regions. Texas is the second largest state next to Alaska. Just think for a minute how massive the state of Texas really is. The textbook says it in a way that just kind of blew my mind, and I wasn't really sure what other way to word this. So they said the longest straight line distance across the state from north to south is 801 miles. The longest east to west distance is 773 miles. To put this into perspective, the north-south distance between New York City and Charleston, South Carolina is 763 miles, cutting across 7 different state lines. The east-west distance between New York City and Chicago is 821 miles, cutting across 6 different states. Texas is ginormous. The first of the 4 regions moving west is the Gulf Coastal Plains, spanning from the Louisiana border and the Gulf of Mexico up along the Rio Grande and up to Del Rio, and then up to the Balcones Fault and Escarpment. The more west you go, the drier it is, and the further east you go, the hillier it is, with lots of pine and timber, lots of hardwoods. This made timber production super popular in the east, where there were actually also some pretty famous oil fields as well. We'll actually talk about those later. Within this region, there were also lots of smaller regions. The western border of the region is called the Blackland Belt, known for its prime farming soil for things like cotton and just other cash crops. The Blackland Belt is now one of the most populated areas in the state and has a diversified manufacturing base. The coastal prairies around Houston and Beaumont were the center for the industrial boom post-World War II, particularly the petrochem industry. In the lower Rio Grande Valley, winter vegetables and fruit production were a major producer. The Rio Grande Plain, which loses much of its very little rainfall to evaporation, is known for livestock. Land grants for this region were offered to Americans willing to move to Texas in the first half of the 19th century, which many Southerners took, leading to the area being known as the birthplace of Texas's political life, plantation slavery, and after the Civil War and Reconstruction of Jim Crow segregation in the state. Not really the best things to be known for, I guess. This area has been dominated by rural conservative values since 1876. Urban areas have become increasingly Democratic, while suburban areas are becoming more Republican. The Interior Lowlands are an extension of the lowlands that run south from Canada and through the Midwest. They're bordered by the Balcones Escarpment on the east and south, and the Cap Rock Escarpment on the west. In the western portion, which rises from 750 feet to 2,000 feet in elevation, West Texas rolling plains contain level, cultivatable land along with a large cattle raising industry. Many of the state's largest ranches are located here. The region is predominantly an agricultural economy and a rural population. Like other rural areas in Texas today, the region is dominated by conservative politics and the Republican Party. The Great Plains take up most of the western Texas border, rising from 2,700 feet in the east to over 4,000 feet in the west. The major city in the north is Amarillo, and the major city in the south is Lubbock. The economy in the north is dominated by ranching and petroleum, while the south is dominated by agriculture and cotton production. Large-scale irrigation from the underwater reservoirs, particularly the Ogallala Aquifer, has played a major role in the economic development of this region. However, the aquifer is being pumped out faster than it's being replenished, raising questions about long-term success using the current irrigation practices. Conservative political values have a home in the Great Plains, although politicians from this area, like the Bush family, have played a major role in Texas government over the last 100 years. Their power has been ebbing in the face of the expanding population of urban areas elsewhere. The Basin and Range province is home to Texas's mountains in the Guadalupe Range, bordering New Mexico, home of Guadalupe Peak and El Capitan. To the southeast is Big Bend country, and then the Rio Grande surrounds it on three sides. While rainfall and population are sparse in this area, it's always had a distinct political culture dominated by the fact that Texas and Mexico have been connected economically and demographically. The population in this region is overwhelmingly Latino. In the 21st century, the border region, including the cities of El Paso, McAllen, and Brownsville, has remained dominated by the Democratic Party. Economic change in Texas. 20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter stated that the capitalist economic system is a process of creative destruction. Capitalism would undergo periodic waves of disruptive transformation fueled by innovation, creating new economies and destroying old ones. During the late 19th century, railroads, steam power, and steel transformed America by nationalizing the market, creating opportunities to buy and sell the same goods and services nationwide. Technological innovation tied to gasoline combustion engines, electricity, the radio, radically restructured the American economy again in the 1920s and then again in the 1980s. The last wave of creative destruction began in the early 21st century with the digital technology tied to the transformation age and the internet. It restructured yet again how economic and social life was conducted. Cotton is one of the oldest crops in Texas, with large-scale cultivation beginning in 1821. Texas then became a leading producer by the 1880s. 40% of the U.S. production still comes from Texas today. As technology advanced, so did the production of cotton, thanks to inventions like barbed wire, new plows, and the railroad system. These things helped increase farmers' productivity and enabled them to enter the national market. In the 1870s, immigrants from Europe and the South moved to Texas to farm, most of which became tenant farmers or sharecroppers. Tenants lived on farms owned by others, providing their own animals, tools, and seed, generally receiving 2/3 of the final value and giving the remainder to the landlord. Sharecroppers are a subset of farmers, furnished only their labor and received only half of the value of the final product. By the 1900s, almost half of the state's farmers were tenants. Two major consequences resulted from these new farmers. It left many rural Texans in a cycle of economic and social dependency through the crop lien system, developed by landlords and merchants to extend credit to farmers who didn't own their own land. And this system, farmers would only profit from their work if their debts had been paid, or if new loans had been made to pay off old debts. The result would often be that farmers were trapped in this like crazy debt cycle. The tenant and sharecropping system also fueled a radical political discontent in rural areas, leading to the Grange and populist movements, which we'll talk about later, both of which played a major role in the defining Texas political culture in the 19th century through the early 20th century. The 1930 census reported that 61% of farmers in Texas were tenant farmers, and that 1/3 of these were sharecroppers. These numbers fell throughout the Great Depression and beyond, and by 1987, only 12% of all the farmers were tenant farmers. The history of the cattle industry was very similar to that of the cotton industry, originating in the late 17th century. Ranching was an alternative to farming when times were tough. And again, the barbed wire and the railroad system assisted with proliferation of ranching in Texas. Conflicts about land often broke out between ranchers and farmers as they sectioned off pastures with their new barbed wire fences. And then, as cattle raising became a more specialized and efficient business, conflicts arose between ranchers and their employees. Though I'm not really sure what the fights were about. If someone does know, I'd really appreciate it if you left it in the comments. Throughout the 20th century, ranching continued struggling when national and international prices collapsed, and then thriving during upturns in the economy. Both industries are now dominated by agribusiness. Texas continues to lead the nation in production of both cotton and livestock, despite the fact that neither dominates the Texas economy anymore. In 1940, 23% of the population lived on farms and ranches. Currently, less than 2% of the population lives on farms and ranches. Oil was discovered in the mid-17th century, but it wasn't until 1894 that anyone really thought to do anything with it, since no one had ever found a large supply of it before. But it wasn't really widely used until the early 1900s. Oil really took off in 1901 with the discovery of the Spindletop oil field near Beaumont. That's one of those famous oil fields in the Gulf Coastal Plains that I mentioned earlier. The oil and gas industry really influenced changes in transportation, industrialization, urbanization, and Texas's overall political life. While the interstate highway systems built in the 1950s and 60s facilitated travel and movement from rural to urban areas. This, combined with the new boom or bust mentality, left many ghost towns in its wake. And I don't really want to go down this rabbit hole right now about ghost towns due to the oil field, but it is really crazy how much damage the oil and gas industry can really cause to a small town. You should definitely look into it. I'm sure that there's videos on YouTube, articles that you can read out there on Google. If you find anything super interesting, please share it in the comments below. I'd really love to read it or watch it. Oil and gas also influenced the rapid industrialization of the Gulf Coast region, and by 1929, Harris County had 27% of all manufacturing employees working in refineries, oil and gas refineries. That number increased by 4 times by the 1940s and just continued to grow. Oil and gas played an important role in the cotton and cattle industry, but also in the state's finances. The state was getting a buttload of money from the oil and gas industry in taxes every year, which in recent years has significantly increased the state's budget by billions. So that's a lot of money that they're making in this industry. Remember when I said that the state uses oil and gas to fund the education or fund public education in Texas? In the book, there's actually a paragraph that says that what many thought was just worthless land at the time had been set aside by the state constitution in 1876 and the state legislature in 1883 as the permanent university fund to support higher education. And then, as luck would have it, oil was actually discovered in the West Texas Permian Basin in 1973 on university land. Soon 17 different wells were producing oil there, sparking a building boom at the University of Texas campus. In 1931, the income of the Permanent University Fund was split between the University of Texas at Austin and the Texas A&M University, with the former receiving 2/3 and the latter 1/3. In 1984, the income was opened up to all University of Texas and Texas A&M schools, along with the royalties from other natural resources on university land. Oil and gas royalties created one of the largest university endowments in the world. In June 2017, the Permanent University Fund held titled 2.1 million acres in 24 counties, primarily in West Texas, and the market value of the fund was calculated to be $19.5 billion. Can you say ka-ching? Like, that's so much. In 1890, after considerable controversy fueled by the populist hostility towards the railroad companies, remember I mentioned the populist a little bit earlier, a constitutional amendment was passed to create the Texas Railroad Commission. In 1917, the commission's powers were extended to the regulation of energy to ensure that the petroleum pipelines transported all producers' oil and gas on equal terms and promote well spacing rules, controlling production by limiting how closely packed together oil wells could be in a particular field. In the 1930s, in an attempt to limit price fluctuations and avoid wasteful production, the commission gained the authority to prorate oil, determining how much every well in Texas was allowed to produce. Through the late 1960s, the Texas Railroad Commission was one of the most important and one of the few democratically elected regulatory bodies in the nation. World oil prices began to collapse in 1982, bottoming out early in 1986 at $10 a barrel. Other sectors of the economy began to suffer as the price of oil fell. The state went through two major recessions, one in 1982 and another in 1986 through 1987. Throughout the 1980s, 370 banks went under in Texas. The state's oil production peaked around 1972, and then decades of decline followed. But beginning in 2008, new technologies such as horizontal drilling and fracking led to a new boom era of oil and gas production in Texas. Through 2017, a large share of the new production came from the Permian Basin region in West Texas, which may be the second largest oil field in the world. But the boom also brought new demands for vast water supplies, an essential component of the new drilling and fracking technologies. With that brought new concerns about the effects of the technology on the environment, since there was little known about it at the time. By 2015, after hovering around $100 a barrel through mid 2014, the price began to steadily decline, fluctuating between $30 and $50 a barrel through the late 2017. I'm not really sure what the price of a barrel of oil is now. If any of you know, I would really appreciate it if you would comment below, letting me know so that I don't have to look it up later now that I'm curious about it. In the 1990s, Texas saw a rapid growth in the economy through a diverse economic base rooted in technology. Today, Texas ranks second in the nation in total manufacturing employment, with metropolitan areas like Austin, Dallas, and Houston standing out as national centers of the high-tech industry. In 2015, 14.34% of the total output of the state came from manufacturing, and 7.3% of the workforce was employed in manufacturing. In a 2014 study released by the Tech America Foundation, they found that Texas was the leading state exporter of technology goods with $45 billion in exports in 2012, approximating that 331,000 jobs in Texas were supported by these exports. The North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, was signed in 1992. It's a trade treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to lower or eliminate tariffs among the three countries. The agreement benefited Texas by accelerating diversification of the economy, stimulating jobs in trade and transportation along the border, and increasing Texas's exports to both Canada and Mexico. Several studies have shown the positive impacts of the agreement on the economy. A study found in 2015 that 56.4% of Texas's total international trade, roughly $356 billion, traveled across the border with Mexico. Almost 58% of this cross-border trade, approximately $204 billion, was through the port of entry at Laredo. International toll bridges alone accounted for 23% of Laredo's general funds revenue in 2012. Statistics from 2017 show that Texas exports totaled $264 billion, up from $207 billion in 2012. Texas exports were 17% of all U.S. exports. The North American market, Mexico and Canada, was the destination for 45% of these exports. Mexico was the top importer of Texas exports and at almost $97 billion in 2017, up from almost $73 billion in 2012. Canada's imports from Texas totaled $23 billion in 2013, up from $19 billion in 2010. Like the book says, although there were some losers in the movement towards free trade with Mexico and Canada, there were also big winners. While the trade agreement has had some positive impacts, there have also been some negative impacts on Texas as well. A 2011 study by the Economic Policy Institute estimated that over 55,000 displaced jobs came from Texas alone. Competition from the lower wage businesses in Mexico or relocation of plants to Mexico is usually what led to the loss of these jobs, but under federal law, these workers were entitled to additional unemployment compensation. There is controversy surrounding NAFTA in regards to immigration and terrorism, with some critics calling for stricter policies on border control and trade. So in response, NAFTA was replaced by a new trade agreement among the United States, Mexico, and Canada, creating the USMCA in late 2018, adding provisions to protect American workers in the car industry from low wages, increasing intellectual property protection, and opening up the Canadian milk market. Initially, people feared free trade maybe cease between the three countries, but they agreed that the increased trade under the proper conditions would benefit all the parties included, and that tariffs served no one, and that the free trade has continued. The military has always played a major role in Texas, from protecting Texans from Native American threats to acting as training facilities in both world wars. The military bases in Texas have long been tied to the economic development of Texas. Today, Texas is home to two of the largest military bases: Fort Bliss, which was opened in 1849, and Fort Hood, both of which generate revenue for state and local communities. In a partnership with the city of El Paso, Fort Bliss actually created the world's largest inland desalination plant, providing fresh water to the base and the city. In 2015, over 163,000 active duty reserve and civilian personnel employed by the U.S. military were living in Texas. The housing bubble in 2007 left the nation in a recession. Texas, however, was one of the last states affected in 2009 and one of the first out of the recession in 2011. Before the recession, employment in Texas had peaked at 10.6 million in August of 2008. From there, through 2009, 427,600 jobs were lost. But by November of 2011, employment had recovered to the pre-recession levels, and by April of 2014, another 829,000 jobs had been added to the Texas economy. Nationally, not so much. It's not until the summer of 2014 that job numbers were only beginning to approach the pre-recession levels. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate in Texas grew to 8.2%, where it stayed throughout most of 2010. It began falling in early 2011 and continued to fall for the next 2 years, dropping from 6.4% in March 2013 to 4% in mid-2018. I'm interested to see how the numbers have changed with everything going on in 2020 and how they're going to continue to change. If you've got any thoughts on that, I would love to hear what you've got to say down in the comments below. Many politicians attributed this miracle to Texas's low taxes, low service, balanced budget policies. However, others attributed it to the relative stability of the Texas housing market compared to that of the other states, the diversified economy, and the oil and gas industry. There's just no other state like Texas. Since the 1850s, Texas's population has steadily increased while becoming more urban and more diverse. In 1850, the population of Texas was 210,000 people, more than a fourth of whom were slaves living in rural areas. According to the 1900 census, only 470 Native Americans still lived in Texas, thanks to the Indian Wars. However, the Native American population in Texas today has significantly changed, estimating roughly 65,000 Native Americans living in Texas today. The population had skyrocketed by the 1900s, estimating at 3 million people. And though the population growth did slow to less than 1% between 1987 and 89, there's been a pretty consistent population surge happening in Texas. By 2017, Texas was estimated to have a population of over 28 million people, and that population is rapidly growing and becoming more and more diverse. Non-Hispanic whites constitute 42% of the population, while Latinos constitute more than 39%. Roughly 13% of the population is African American and 5% are Asian. 85% of Texans live in urban areas, with many involved in an economy driven by the high-tech industry and globalization. More than 28% of the population have a bachelor's degree. As a whole, Texans are younger, with more than 26% being under the age of 18 and only about 12% of them being over the age of 65. Three factors account for this growth: a natural increase between births and deaths, international immigration, and domestic immigration. Historically, the largest ethnic group in Texas were non-Hispanic whites, like the English, Germans, Scots, Irish, Czech, and European Jews. The first wave of whites came to Texas before the break with Mexico, encouraged by impresarios like Moses Austin and his son Stephen F. Austin, who were actually given the authority to bring people to Texas by these Spanish and later Mexican leaders. The people that they brought would typically be just looking for cheap land, but they brought opinions and values about the democratic government, paving the way for the Texas Revolution. After the Revolution, more white immigrants came from what were the Confederate states looking for cheap land, but they also brought new cultural baggage with them, slavery. By the Civil War, these new white people dominated the political culture, and while Texas farmers didn't all own slaves themselves, most of them supported the secession from the Union and the right to have slaves. The white population peaked at 74% in 1950, but has since declined steadily to 42% in 2017. Following the new waves of domestic immigration, the white population can no longer be as easily defined as rural or conservative. A new wave of white immigration into Texas over the past 40 years has redefined the political culture of white Texans. You can't assume that the white Texan lives on a farm, holds culturally conservative values, and is tied to the Democratic Party. They may not even have been born in Texas, and they may even be an urbanite with progressive values, or a suburban Republican. You just never know anymore. Things aren't like they were 100 years ago. Most Latinos in Texas are of Mexican descent, refugees of the political and economic instability in Mexico. In the early 19th century, roughly 5,000 people of Mexican descent were living in Texas, and by 1850 that number was up to roughly 14,000. And over the next 75 years, Texas has become a refuge from political and economic stability in Mexico, among other Latin countries. The Mexican American population in Texas grew from an estimated 700,000 in 1930 to over 1 million in 1960 and over 5 million in 2000. Immigration from other Latin countries also increased. In 2015, there were over 10.6 million Latinos residing in Texas, making up over 19% of the Latinos in the United States. Many Latinos migrated across Texas to work as laborers in the agricultural sector, while others took jobs in urban areas, becoming majorities in the San Antonio and El Paso areas. Latinos didn't have full political equality until the mid-20th century, having to face white primaries and poll taxes, much like the African American population. Poll taxes are a state tax imposed as a requirement for voting. Poll taxes were rendered unconstitutional in national elections by the 24th Amendment and in state elections by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1966. Henry Gonzalez became the first Mexican-American Texas senator in 1956, and in the 1960s, Latino influence grew through political movements like the La Raza Unida Party and through Latino leaders being elected into office. The number of Latinos elected into public office rose from 1,400 in 1986 to 2,500 in 2011. And then in 2016, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials reported that one Latino served the U.S. Senate from Texas, 5 Latinos represented Texas in the U.S. House of Representatives, 7 Latinos were in the Texas Senate, and 35 Latinos were elected into the state legislature. In addition, the association reported that over almost 2,500 Latinos served as local officials in Texas. Most African Americans entered Texas as slaves brought by whites from Southern American states. The slave population grew exponentially after independence from Mexico and through the Civil War, becoming roughly 1/3 of Texas's population. Emancipation for African Americans in Texas didn't come until June 19th, 1865, which is now celebrated as Juneteenth. Black Texans were considered second-class citizens and were disenfranchised by the political system until the mid-20th century, when a series of court decisions and federal laws offered some progress. Between 1865 and 1868, the state and the various cities passed a series of black codes that restricted the rights of former slaves, leading to things like Jim Crow laws. New opportunities were found for former slaves who supported the radical republic wing of the federal government. 10 African American delegates actually helped write the Texas Constitution of 1869, and 43 of them served on the state legislature between 1868 and 1900. However, the end of Reconstruction and the return of power to the Democratic Party in the mid-1870s reversed most of the progress made by Black Texans. In 1900, over 100,000 African Americans voted in Texas elections. By 1903, the number had fallen to under 5,000, largely because of the imposition of poll taxes in 1902, and then the passage of an early version of the white primary law in 1903. In 1923, the legislature explicitly banned blacks from voting in the Democratic primary. Segregation became the focus of public policy, backed by the police power of the state and reinforced by lynching and race riots against African Americans across the state. Between 1885 and 1942, 339 African Americans were lynched in Texas, most of which took place in the eastern portion of the state. Federal court cases in the 1940s and 1950s offered some hope of relief. Smith v. Allwright in 1944 outlawed the white-only primary, and Sweat, I'm not sure, v. Painter in 1950 guaranteed African American admissions to graduate and professional schools at the state colleges and universities. And then finally, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 outlawed the segregation of public schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped open the political system to African Americans, and in 1966, a small number of African American candidates began to win the political offices in the state. In 1972, Barbara Jordan became the first African American woman from Texas to be elected into the U.S. House of Representatives. Today, the state's African American population is concentrated in East Texas and major urban areas. African American political leaders play major roles in these areas as members of Congress, the state legislature, and city councils, as well as being the mayor or as mayors of Houston and Dallas beginning in the late 1990s. The Asian American population in Texas has grown in recent years, with individuals largely from India, Vietnam, China, Pakistan, Korea, and Japan making up roughly 4.5% of the state's population. In 2017, the U.S. Census Bureau estimated that 1 million Asian Americans resided in Texas. Asians tend to be concentrated in the urban and suburban areas of Texas, particularly in West Houston and Fort Bend County, the western and northern suburbs of Dallas, Arlington, and Austin, and its suburbs. Sizable pockets of Asian Americans are also found along the Gulf Coast. Texas tends to have a younger population than the national average. In 2015, 27.3% of the population was estimated to be under 18 years old, compared to the 24% nationally, while 12% of the population was over the age of 65, compared to the 16% nationally. Because younger people tend to make less than older people, the incomes in Texas tend to lag behind those of the nation as a whole. In 2017, Texas's per capita income ranked 25 out of the 50 states. The percentage of the population in Texas with incomes below the poverty level fell from almost 16% to just under 15% between 1990 and 2004, and then rose again to over 17% in 2014. At the same time, the national poverty rate fell from 13.5% to 11.7%, and then rose to just under 15% in 2014. Urbanization is the process by which people move from rural to urban areas. Suburbanization is when people move out of the city centers to surrounding areas. Texas is now 85% urban, with suburbanization continuing to expand the metropolitan areas. Urbanization transformed Texas political life from a rural-based economy to that of one of a large city with diverse economies. The Spanish influence on the urban life in Texas grew out of an effort to extend territorial control northward out of Mexico through a series of garrisons, missions, and pueblos. White American influence began with the arrival in 1820, when the Spanish offered the Austins and other impresarios land grants to encourage the movement of Americans into underpopulated regions of Texas. The Texas politics grew out of the state rural-based economy centered on cotton, cattle, oil, and natural gas. The expansion of Texas's urban life began along the Gulf Coast and gradually moved west, particularly along the rivers. New technologies played a key role in the transformation of the state's urban landscape. Dredging technologies stimulated the growth of port cities such as Houston, Galveston, Corpus Christi, and Brownsville. And railroad construction in the second half of the 19th century opened up new lands to regional and national markets, as well as to economic development. In 1880, there were only 11 towns of 4,000 or more people in all of Texas. With the rapid expansion of railroads in the 1880s and the 1890s, that number rose to 36 by 1900. By 1910, the railroad network of over 13,000 miles was completed. Texas had 49 towns with a population of 4,000 or more people. By 1920, 5 cities, Dallas, El Paso, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio, all had populations of over 50,000 people. These population patterns would be reinforced by later technological breakthroughs, such as cars and air travel. In order to understand how the complexities of Texas government and politics, you have to take a look at the four most important metropolitan areas in Texas, like Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin. Houston is the largest city in Texas and the fourth largest city in the nation, with a population of over 2.3 million people. The metro area in 2011 was home to roughly 6.1 million people. Houston was founded in 1836 by two brothers, Augustus Chapman Allen and John Kirby Allen, who wanted to create a great interior commercial emporium of Texas. Naming the city after Sam Houston and bringing with them Southern traditions like slavery and racism. Houston's economy originally centered around cotton and commerce, starting in the late 19th century thanks to the railroads, and then the city expanded as a deep water port with the opening of the Houston Ship Channel, which is the second or third busiest deep water port in the United States. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is now comprised of multiple cities, each with populations of over 100,000 people, including Arlington, Mesquite, Garland, Richardson, Irving, Plano, McKinney, Carrollton, Grand Prairie, Frisco, and Denton. The area is joined together by interlocking highways running north, south, and east-west, with a major international airport strategically located in the middle. Today, Dallas is known for high-tech and manufacturing jobs, but Dallas was originally founded as a trading post in 1841 near where two railroads were going to be built by the Republic. By the 1850s, it had become a retail center servicing surrounding rural areas with a population that reached over 3,000 by 1870. The coming of the Houston and Texas Central Railroad in 1871 and the Texas and Public Railroad in 1873 made Dallas the first rail crossroads in Texas and transformed its place in the state's economy. As cotton became a major cash crop, the city's population more than tripled by 1880 to more than 10,000 people. By the turn of the 20th century, Dallas had grown to more than 42,000 people. Conveniently located at the crossroad of two rail lines, with the discovery of oil in East Texas in 1930, Dallas became the banking hub for the oil industry, while Fort Worth was the hub of the cattle industry. By the end of World War II, the economy had diversified, making Dallas a minor manufacturing center, and in the 1950s and 1960s, technology companies transformed Dallas into the third largest tech center in the nation. The high-tech boom of the 1990s was built from the corporate infrastructure laid down in the 1950s and 1960s. Dallas grew from over 844,000 people in 1970 to over 1.3 million people in 2017. Fort Worth was originally an army post in 1849, but by 1853 the military had abandoned it as new forts were built in the west. After the 1870s, because Fort Worth was a convenient place for cowboys to rest on their cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, cattle buyers established headquarters in the city. In 1900, Fort Worth was served by 8 railroad companies, most of them transporting cattle and related products to national markets. The two world wars encouraged more economic development in Fort Worth. Over 100,000 troops were trained at Camp Bowie during World War I, and World War II brought an important Air Force base and along with it the aviation industry. An aviation company then became the largest manufacturer in the city. Between 1900 and 1950, Fort Worth's population grew from just under 27,000 to over 277,000 people. By 2017, the population was over 874,000 people. The overall metropolitan area of Dallas-Fort Worth included 6.954 million people in 2014. San Antonio grew out of the Spanish Prestado San Antonio de Bexar, which was founded in 1718, becoming the capital of Spanish Texas in 1773, with 2,100 people. Because of the threats posed by Native Americans and Mexicans after the Texas Revolution, this figure had declined to about 800 people by 1846. On Texas's entry into the Union, the population took off in 1850, reaching over 3,488 people and 8,235 people by 1860. Immigrant groups from Germany added distinct culture and language styles to the rapidly growing city. By the Civil War, San Antonio was the largest city in Texas. Stimulated by the building of the San Antonio Railroad in 1877, the population continued to grow, and by 1920 it had reached over 161,000 people. Mexican immigration increased significantly following the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and the building of the city infrastructure that provided paved railroads, utilities, water, telephones, and hospitals. Military bases built during World War II helped to increase the population after a slow in 1930s, making it the second largest city in Texas today. By 1960, the population topped 587,000 people. The population of the city was estimated to be over 1.5 million in 2017, and the metropolitan area had a population of 2.2 million in 2014. San Antonio's population has become increasingly Latino. In Bexar County in 2017, approximately 60.3% of the people are Latino, 27.7% are white, and 8.5% are African American. Unlike Houston or Dallas, San Antonio doesn't really have high-paying manufacturing jobs, and the average metropolitan income is significantly lower than that of the ones in Houston and Dallas. The economy rests on four legs: national military bases, educational institutions, tourism, and a large medical research complex. Austin is the current capital of Texas, located in central Texas. Remember I said that San Antonio was the capital of Spanish Texas. Well, after that, the capital changed multiple times until settling along the Colorado River near Waterloo, which incorporated Austin in December of 1839 during the Lamar administration. Then when Houston took over again, he said basically, no way, we're moving this bad boy back to Houston. And then he decided to move it to Washington on the Brazos until 1845, when Texas joined the U.S. And on February 19th, 1846, as Texas transitioned from a nation to a state, Austin became the permanent capital of Texas. Austin began to gradually grow, reaching a population of 3,546 people in 1860. The emergence of the Houston and Texas Central Railroad in 1871 linked Austin to the eastern part of the state, and it turned it into a trading center in central Texas. By 1880, the city's population had grown to over 11,000 people. Two events in the 1880s proved to be important benchmarks for Austin's future: the construction of UT and the building of the new Capitol at the center of Austin. Austin's economy rests on three solid foundations: being the hub of government business, the University of Texas, and the high-tech industry, grown from the seeds planted by the government and the university activity. In 2012 to 2013, it was estimated that the school generated $8.8 billion in Texas business activity. Austin's economic base was narrow for the early decades of the 20th century. Except for the benefits gleaned from the university's endowment, Austin missed out on much of the economic development flowing from the rise of oil and gas production. The population of the city was over 22,000 in 1900, growing to 53,000 in 1930, and then up to 132,000 in 1950, where it then began to surge in the second half of the 20th century, growing to almost 700,000 by 2000. This increase was due to a rapid diversifying economy led by the high-tech sector. In 2017, Austin had an estimated population of 950,000 people and was demographically 48% white, 35% Latino, 7% Black, and 7% Asian. Today, Austin leads Texas's largest cities in per capita income and degree-holding adults and is the fourth largest metropolitan area in Texas. In this chapter, we studied the political culture of Texas and saw how the state has transformed due to the economic and demographic changes. 3 incredible technological revolutions have changed the state's economy. These economic transformations have been fueled by ongoing demographic changes that redefine who the typical Texan is. Texas has become a melting pot of cultures and concerns and will likely continue to be defined by economic and demographic changes. Latinos will continue to play an increasingly important role in the economic and political life of Texas. President Trump's call to reevaluate NAFTA may change Texas's connection with the world economy, but it's hard to imagine a world where Texas doesn't survive and thrive. The chapter objectives I mentioned earlier included being able to describe the defining characteristics of political culture in Texas, explain how Texas's geography has influenced its political culture, trace the evolution of Texas's economy, and explain how the population of Texas has changed over time. So, what are the defining characteristics of political culture in Texas? Texas's political culture can best be characterized as individualistic and traditional. Texans have a huge amount of state pride and have adopted a famous phrase, "Don't mess with Texas," intimidating those who wish to change the state's way of doing things. Texas is a low-tax state with distrust for large government programs. Business plays a major role in defining political culture in the state of Texas. How has Texas's geography influenced its political culture? Because Texas is ginormous, the state's topography is super diverse. East Texas has super flat lands, West Texas has a super arid climate, and Central Texas is known for its hill country. All of these represent diverse ecosystems and land patterns. Trace the evolution of Texas's economy. The Texas economy has undergone 3 major technological transformations over the past 100 years. Texas's economy was originally based in cotton and ranching, then on oil production, becoming important in the 20th century. Today, technology and international trade play important roles in the state's economy, and it appears that Texas weathered the Great Recession better than most other states. How has the population of Texas changed over time? Texas has changed significantly. Once dominated by whites, Texas can now be considered a majority-minority state due to a large Latino population that, when combined with the African American population and the other minorities like the Asian population, dominate the state population. Texans tend to be younger and poorer than the average American, despite the considerable amount of wealth in Texas. So that's it for this chapter. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you learned something new. Please feel free to reach out to me in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe. I really appreciate you taking the time out to watch this video today. Thank you so much.